In this time are two things. One is I want to talk a little bit about the R and M and the S. I'm going to have to give you some big picture overview kinds of things. Then we have set aside some time for questions and answers for Q&A. So if you've had some questions or some come up that you want to think about, we will take some time for that. I'll probably stop about 10:05 of 2 because we'll start the questions and answer then, but I want to keep 10 minutes at the end because there's just a story about one of the churches that I think you will find interesting that we've worked with and what God does with all of this. By the way, if you want to contact ECO about things, Kim at eco-press.org is the person to contact. We've talked to some of you, maybe, in fact, I've said to Barry, I would just encourage this Presbytery to think about maybe doing a core cohort. There's such synergy when there's 7, 8 congregations working on this all together. We've just found that with both cohorts that we're now working with, and I found that as I work with other denominations where we follow the same strategy. I worked for 5 years with 2 years of an intense cohort, but 5 years with a Wesleyan district in New York, New England. Started in Albany, went up to New England. There were 41 churches there. The largest church was the Cobleskill Church at 180, and it was plateaued. Most of the churches were under 100, a lot were under 50. And I tell Wesleyans they do the best job I know of anybody of building a church where nobody can find it. And, you know, they were up in the Adirondacks and the Catskills and other places. You just couldn't find them. And by 5 years, 20 of the 41 churches, all of them were either plateaued or declined, 20 were growing. And for the last 5 years now, at the end of the year, they count up all the conversions from all 41 churches, and they're now seeing over 500 people every year come to Christ because of what's happening in these churches. So God just uses this process to help churches really turn around and help pastors to develop relationships with each other that encourages the whole process of transformation. So Kim at ECO, I'm going to leave that one there so at least you have that email. All right, what I want to talk about briefly is the R, and I'm only going to talk one thing about the R, but it's probably the most fundamental. I've had some guesses as to my poor artwork up here. Okay, this is not a rectangle pepperoni pizza. Somebody asked that, okay. It's not a domino. These are Legos. Got it? Good. All right. I don't know what you win, but you win something. All right, Legos. Okay. People are like Legos. You play with Legos by connecting them. And I mentioned the fact that every church tells me it's the friendliest church in town. And many of them are. But I also made the point last night, it's obvious that friendliness does not grow churches because if our churches are also friendly, they should be growing. And that's because when people come to church, they expect the church to be friendly. It's not a surprise if it is. It's a disappointment if it isn't, but it's not a surprise if it is. But people, in essence, are not looking for friendly congregations. They are looking for friends. And there is a major difference between being friendly and a place where you can make friends. Now, the reason I've drawn these Legos with 8 connectors on them, because that's how you play with Legos, is that the average person, whether at work, at school, at church, whatever, the average person wants to have about 8 sustained relationships with people. Now, we will know more, we will talk to more people, but there's about 8 people over a period of every 2 or 3 months you want to see and talk about this, do something together. Now, if you're an introvert, your Lego only has 2 connectors on it, okay? If you're an extrovert, your Lego has about 16 connectors on it, okay? So the average is just about 8. Now, when people have been in a church 2, 3, 4 years, and in case of our churches in California, many of them have been there 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, their Lego was full. They could make no more connections. But when a new person walks into church, if they don't know anyone, we call them gatekeepers. I mean, sometimes they marry into the church, other times maybe their fellow co-worker goes to church, or if they're teachers, they teach at the same school, and that person helps them get into the group. But if they don't know anyone, and in our churches, that meant that they were walking in hoping that one of the things that would happen particularly the less churched they are, the de-churched, unchurched. They're looking for a friend, not realizing that it was impossible for them to be friends with anyone in the congregation. You could be friendly with them. You could be nice to them. But the problem was, the friendlier you were, the lonelier they felt, because they couldn't connect, which is why often you see people come to a church, maybe in a period of a month, they'll come one Sunday or another Sunday, and then there'll be maybe another Sunday, and then you never see them again. Because they come in and say, is anybody going to connect with us, and can we connect with people? And it doesn't happen. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is different from what we did back in our churches in 1997, to show you how committed our older people were, because that's all we had in our church. We didn't have younger people. We didn't have empty nesters. We had older people. That's all we had, and I am now one. I mean, but you know, most of our churches, when I was there, I could have been the youth pastor. That's how old the congregation was at that point. So they all had full Legos, but they wanted to grow. So we said, who's going to be in charge of assimilation, helping new people get connected? And usually it was a couple. An older couple would raise their hand. And we said, okay, so this is going to be your ministry. They said, that's right. He said, all right, here's what you've got to do. And we would announce this to the whole church. You know, Bill and Mary are going to be in charge of assimilation. So for the next year, they're going to not be friends with 6 of you, because they have to empty off their Lego so they have room to connect. And so when I say even a younger couple would come into the church, maybe a younger couple with a child, you know, they came to church, and so Bill and Mary knew that their job was to go over and say hello to them, see if you could get an email, phone number, just talk to them. And suppose they got a phone number. So Tuesday night, Mary calls, gets the wife on the line and says, by the way, we were delighted to see you in church last week, or last Sunday. We've already sent you some information, and et cetera. We're just glad you're here. Would you like to come over to our house for dinner this Friday night? And the other person said, well, we'd love to come over for dinner Friday night, but our son has a soccer game. Well, can we go to your son's soccer game? You want to go to our son's soccer game? Not really. We would love to go to your son's soccer game. Okay. And you go to the soccer game. A couple weeks later, they come over for dinner. Maybe a week after that, you go to a movie. So when that person comes back to church, they have somebody they're realizing they're beginning to connect with. Now, we had to teach Bill and Mary. As the church begins to grow and you get to know more people, your job is to be a broker, because if more people come, once your Lego fills up again, you can't do anything. So you have to be helping new people connect with new people. Today, we do it a little bit differently. And here's how we do it. A couple comes in, an individual single comes in, and if you can get any kind of information. Now, by the way, one of the good things today with children is people want to make sure their children are secure. Make sure kids, they have to fill all this stuff out for the children, because that says to them, we care about your children, but it also gives you their information if you don't fill out a card. So then you send them an email on Tuesday or Monday. In fact, I've been in large churches of 1,000, where the senior pastor will tell me, every Sunday afternoon I do 1-minute phone calls. I'll have 25, say, new people who filled something out, and he says, I know they're 1-minute phone calls. I have one pastor goes, because they come during the commercial and the football games. Okay, and then he says, I get compliments that nobody can think a pastor can talk on the phone for just 1 minute. Okay, I do 1-minute phone calls, so they're contacted. But somewhere in all that initial information that goes out, you tell them. Now, in smaller churches, in 3 months, on the 4th Sunday of that 3rd month, there's going to be, right after church, pizza with the pastor, or pasta with the pastor, or if you're from California, gluten-free salad with the pastor. Okay, but there's going to be something to eat with the pastor. The next week, they don't come back, but they get another email. Thank you. We're sorry we missed you. By the way, don't forget this such and date, pizza with the pastor. 3rd week, pizza with the pastor. 4th week, pizza. They're contacted, and then that week before, of all the people you've had, you send them an invitation. Remember, this coming Sunday is right after church, pizza with the pastor, etc. Now, when that happens in your church, as soon as church is over, the pastor and the pastor's spouse need to go wherever the dinner is. And they sit there with maybe 2 singles or 3 couples or 5 people. No one else from the church should sit there. And the reason you shouldn't sit there is you're nice people, and if you talk to them, they're going to think you're going to be their friend. The problem is you can't be their friend because you have a full Lego. So here's the agenda for the pastor and the pastor's spouse. Number one, you want to find out things about all these people. By the way, there's always 4 network questions you can ask. Where are you from? Where do you live? Where do you work? And tell us about your family. And so you begin to find out. Secondly, they want to know some things about you and your spouse, so you share some things. Hopefully by that time you have your 10-minute vision stump speech. Folks, let me tell you why we're looking for people to be a part of our church. As we look at our community, we see all these people have all these needs. And in 5 years, we're hoping we can touch at least 5,000 people to show them the love of Jesus Christ, just to get them to know that there are people in this community that care for them, and you share with them that second number that we talked about. But then for the rest of the time, around that meal, because everybody else is serving, so the pastor and the pastor's spouse never gets up, the pastor's job and the spouse's job are to help these people meet each other. Because here's the deal, folks. If people can make a friend within 1 or 2, 3 months of coming, they will come back. Okay, why? Because they're looking for friends. So that's why you don't have members of the session sit there. Good people, but they have full Legos. You are constantly putting empty Lego people with people who still have partially empty Legos. And that's the whole basis of an assimilation process. When you're reading Fusion, that's the whole basis behind Fusion and bringing people to church. And by the way, an assimilation ministry to guests is one of the primary ministries to help churches grow. In this day and age, now, if the person is coming from another church, it's a different story. And you know, if people are coming from another church and they want to come to your church, that's great, because hopefully your vision's exciting. You want people to be a part of the vision. But you want people coming who have little church background. If they visit your church, maybe they've come to some of your bridge events, and now they're there on a Sunday to see what you're like, okay? That is a major decision. I mean, for those of us older people who were raised in Christendom, going to church is automatic. Now, that doesn't mean we do it. It just means we feel guilty when we don't. But it's automatic. For people in this day and age who are 50 or younger, who are the least bit church, going to church is a decision that Sunday morning. It's not like you're driving to Lowe's Hardware and say, let's stop at Dairy Queen. It's not like they're on the way to Target and say, oh, let's stop at church. They have made a decision to come there. The easiest mission field to reach, the cheapest mission field to reach, are the people who show up on your campus Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And it's the mission field most of our churches ignore, which is why you need to stay in contact with them and help them begin to meet other new people. Because if they will make friends, they will stay. Another change in our culture is this. In this day and age, people want to participate before they join. And so it's great if in the first month or two that people are coming, if they come back for the second time or the third time, if you can ask them to do something. Some of our churches now are saying we want to involve people in the first or second or third month at the latest. So if you're doing a lot with assimilation and you have coffee and refreshments and whatever out there, ask people, hey, would you mind bringing refreshments on every fourth Sunday? Would you want to help us with the parking? Would you want to help us when people come in to be greeters? And because often the best greeters, first of all greeters should be trained. Most greeters are not trained. All greeters need to be trained, but they need to be people that really greet and are happy to see people. I mean, I've actually had greeters that kind of look the other way when they hand me a church bulletin, and say, I'm just glad I'm here. But people need to be involved. If they can get involved and make a friend, that's the beginning of an assimilation process. And that's how churches begin to grow. And so that's really what I want to say about the R because of the time factor. But for those of you, the book Fusion was mentioned by Nelson Searcy. If you and your church want to see how to treat guests, how to reach guests, you need to be reading Fusion. As every church I go into in the country that's doing a good job of reaching guests. I told you about this church in Cobleskill, New York. When I'm working with churches east of the Mississippi, I tell them to go to Cobleskill because the church is between 400 and 500. It's not a mega church in a little town. And even though it's winter in that part of New York, there have people out in the parking lot on Sunday mornings, greeting people, having umbrellas if it's snowing to walk in seniors and single single moms and whatever. They want people to know that when they come in, they have people ready to meet them. And that church is growing because of the way they connect, helping friends make friends. So the reason why our friendly churches don't grow is not because we're friendly, it's because there's no room for people to make friends, and that has to be worked at intentionally. It is not something you can just relax. It is the hardest job in the church, but it is one of the most important jobs in the church if you want to see your church grow. Okay? So that's the R. Now, I want to talk about the M and the S together, ministry and structure. And I want to share with you a fourth assumption. Now, remember the first assumption I shared with you is that which is healthy grows and reproduces. By the way, this assumption is not on your notes. I'm going to show it to you in a minute. The second assumption is Jesus didn't create the church for Christians, but to mobilize Christians to reach lost people. The third assumption is the gospel never changes, but the church must change constantly. Here's the fourth assumption. Churches from 0 to 200 are like apples. Okay? By the way, 80 to 85% of all churches in the United States never get past 200. And almost all the eco churches I've worked with have been churches of less than 200. And I'm talking about worship attendance. I'm not talking about membership. Today, people vote with their feet and their pocketbook. So I want to see who's voting every week by showing up. Churches from 200, they talk about breaking the 200 barrier, to 1,000 are oranges. Okay. Churches from 1,000, there are now churches in Latin America over 40,000 people. Nazarenes have an awesome church in Medellin, Colombia, right in the midst of the drug that's over 40,000 people, with people coming to Christ and people getting serious about reproducing new Christians. These churches are simply bigger oranges. Now, here's the point. Small churches, churches under 200, whether they're 20, 75, 150, 180, average, churches under 200 are small because they have less people, but they are small because they are designed to be small. Okay? It's not just a quantity issue, it's a quality issue. Large churches, churches that have broken the 200 barrier, and churches to 1,000 are large not just because they have more people, but they are designed to be large. So small churches are small because they're designed to be small, and large churches are large because they're designed to be large. Now, let me give you the two major differences between an orange and an apple. Now, don't get hung up on the metaphor. I've had people say, well, let's see, oranges are segments and apples have seeds. If that doesn't work, just make it a dog and a cat, okay? Now, I'm just talking about oranges and apples, okay? Small churches are small because they are relationally led. Relationships trump mission. Large churches are large because mission trumps relationships. So many of our churches, Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so had been playing the organ or the piano for 50 years. They played poorly. The music was not great. Because of it, worship suffered tremendously. But they've been doing it for 50 years. And hurting their feelings was more important than all the people who showed up as guests and never came back because of the worship. You with me? Relationships trump mission. By the way, you have to understand that excuse did not work at Nuremberg. Yeah, I killed all those Jews, but that's because the general told me. You were expected to stand up and take responsibility. Okay. So, session members. I think if I function in church as an elder, I need to give an account to God for the church for 2018. How'd we do? Okay. Did we put the mission first, or did we put relationships first? I mean, one of the things, if you look at Jesus, as much as he valued relationships, the mission always took priority. Mark 2, he heals all those people after Peter's mother, he heals Peter's mother-in-law. Says the streets are filled with people. Once the Sabbath is over, I think the kids were out running around during the Sabbath. They told everybody, so they all showed up with sick people. The next morning, the disciples can't find Jesus. They finally find him out there praying, and they say, you got to come back to the city. There's more people who want to get healed. And Jesus says, no, we have to go here. I have to be on mission. Mission trumps relationships. That's the difference between an apple and an orange. The second difference between an apple and an orange is apples are group-led. Oranges are leader-led. So I don't care if you're congregational. I mean, my background is Baptist, I know, and I keep telling the Baptist, I told our churches, do you realize whenever a large group in Scripture make a decision, it's always the wrong one? Okay. But most of our churches, even though they were Baptists, functioned like Presbyterian churches. They had a board of deacons who made most of the decisions. You know, once a year they'd have an annual meeting where you could fire the pastor. That was there. But I mean, you know, the congregation made a few decisions. But for the most part, the deacons did it. In Presbyterian churches, it's the session that does it. In Anglican churches, it's the vestry that does it. It's the group that is led. If you look at Scripture, God primarily works through leaders. He does not work through groups. Now, hear me well, I believe in a plurality of elders, but I believe most elders are doing the wrong job. So 1 Peter 5, I remind elders, if you're on session, you do not represent the congregation. This is not Parliament. This is not Congress, which, by the way, is doing so well. Okay. You work for the chief shepherd. And shepherds in Jesus' day led sheep by still waters and led sheep into green pastures in order to do three things with the sheep. They wanted their wool, they wanted their meat, which is kind of total commitment, and they wanted them to reproduce. So I've been in churches where the church starts to grow, and we say to the church, you got to go to 2 services, and people say, we can't go to 2 services, I won't know everybody. And my response is, I've met half the congregation, maybe it's better if you don't meet everybody. Okay? The purpose of the shepherd was not to please the sheep. The reason why they led them into green pastures, the reason why they led them into still waters, was so that the sheep would do the mission of having sheep. That's the job of the session. It's the leader's job to figure out how to do that and then to be accountable to the session. So larger churches are leader-led. Smaller churches are group-led. Now, with knowing that, here's the assumption. We have learned that if you're a church that's an apple, you must act like an orange if you want to grow. We did not teach churches of 50 how to be a church of 100. We did not teach churches of 100 how to be a church of 150. We did not teach a church of 150 how to be a church of 250. We taught churches of 50 how to be a church of 1,000. One of the smallest congregations I've seen turn around was a congregation in Maine. Now, you're on the East Coast, you have some idea of what Mainers are like. I mean, they're the most independent cusses you could know, okay? I mean, they were here before the American Revolution, they will be here after the American Revolution. And change is a 4-letter word in Maine. So I was asked to work with this church up in the middle of Maine, a little town of about 15,000 with nothing around it but woods and mountains. And the church was over 200 years old. The year I worked there, their building, which was a historic landmark, was celebrating its 200th anniversary, and it set 300 people. It was kept in pristine condition, And at 9 o'clock every Sunday morning, the chimes would play, and the whole community said, "Isn't that quaint?" But on a good Sunday, they had 23 people. So I was asked by the denomination to go work with that church. I said, "Well, thank you for giving me one of your better congregations, but we'll come and work with it." So I got there on Friday. The pastor had just gotten out of seminary, was so naive he didn't know he shouldn't have gone there. Had no idea what to do. I interviewed him for 2 hours. I normally then they had a church secretary who was in her 80s, so we shouted at each other for an hour. Okay. On Friday night, I did a focus group. Well, when you only have 23 people, that is a focus group. So I met with all 23 people. On Saturday, I meet with the leaders. Well, they only had 23 people, so we met with all 23 people. And I sensed once again from these 23 people that a number of them wanted to see their church become a church that would change this community. So I said to them, "You've got to change." And literally, one older guy said, "What's the first change?" I said, "I want to ask you a question." Now, I knew the answer, but I said, "I want to ask you a question. Where do you sit on Sunday morning?" All 23 people sat scattered across a back of a 300-seat auditorium. You could have shot a machine gun through there and missed them all. I said, "Tomorrow morning, when I get up to preach, I would like all of you, please, in the first 8 pews. We'll give you maps. Okay. We'll dust them off." Now, I really did not think they would do it. I got up to preach on Sunday morning, and everybody sat in the first 8 pews. I said, "Wow, thank you." But I said, "I'm glad you're here, and don't misunderstand, but here's the question. Are you going to be here in these first 8 pews 8 weeks from now? Or next Sunday, are you going back to your pew?" It's like Norm's stool. Nobody else sits on it. To your pew. And 2 weeks from now, a stranger gets lost and finds your church by accident and walks in and has to walk past all of you and look like a big red pimple on somebody's nose. Or are you going to be sitting here 8 weeks from now, and when they come in, they say, "There may not be many people here, but at least they're interested enough to be up front"? We did the weekend, and I left. For 4 years, I never heard a word about that church. In fact, I often wonder, what happened to that church in Maine? About 4 years later, I'm in Kansas City at a conference, and I see the denominational person who had invited me to come. I said, "Whatever happened to that church?" He said, "Oh, Paul," he said, "they're averaging 125. They've got young kids coming. They've already seen 6 people this year come to Jesus. Children are coming." I said, "Would you quick email that pastor and tell him that Rick Warren cannot compete with those percentages?" Because in 4 years, they had quintupled because we taught them to act like a church of 1,000. Okay? And so one of the things we do is we work with churches to help them through their start a new turnaround, is to say, you've got to think like an orange while you are still an apple. And that's why we have seen our churches that were down to 50, 60 people today be larger than they ever were in their past. Churches of 400 and 600 and 800. I remember working with a church in Lemoore, California. Lemoore is down in the San Joaquin Valley, where they say about 25% of all the food for the United States comes from that big valley. Lemoore had been a town of about 10 to 12,000, and back in I think it was in the 60s, the town doubled almost overnight because the U.S. Navy put an air station there. And all the pilots who fly off the carriers in the Pacific are stationed at Lemoore. Now, when I did the consultation with the church there, it was about 1999, 2000, somewhere in there. There were only about 30, 40 people there on Sunday. The pastor had left. The church secretary had run the church for years anyway, so they really didn't need a pastor, and so what else? And we did the weekend, and we drove away, and I said to the person who was with me, I said, "God's not going to do anything at this church. Well, we were creating, this whole role of transitional pastors. And so we invited this transitional pastor to go to the church. The gentleman only stood about this high. It was interesting. He was a musician and a great worship leader and an evangelist. And he shows up, and within a month or two, he had fired the church secretary, another church boss, and their spouses left with them. The church is down to about 20, 25. The church began to grow, began to see some people come to Jesus. And when they were about 75, they got a new pastor. It was very interesting. The weekend I was there, they said, now, if we grow, you realize we don't mess with the naval personnel. They're temporary. So I guess if you're temporary, you don't need Jesus at this point, okay? That church today, with the same pastor who came, is running now about 2,000 in a town of 25,000. And 40% of the congregation are naval personnel. In fact, he gets emails and texts now from pilots who hear they're going to be transferred to Lemoore and say, I've heard about your church. We'll be there. What can we do before they ever show up? In fact, he says, I would much rather have military personnel in my church. They know how to take orders. Okay. They know they're temporary, so they hit the ground running. They understand the sense of mission. They understand the sense of vision. And God is using this pastor now to go around the country to talk to churches near military bases about how that church can grow and how they can reach. And they realize we're not just a church for Lemoore, we're a church for the world, because we're shaping people's lives that are going to go all around the world and do the mission of Jesus Christ. Because we taught that church to act like a church of 1,000. Now, let me talk a little bit about the strategy, and then I'm going to stop and take some questions. I'll talk about the strategy and a little bit how that relates to the structure at this point. But now I'm talking about ministries. Everybody comes to the church as a consumer. Even unbelievers, if they show up, are consumers. Will you help me with my marriage? Can you help me with our family? Our kids are on drugs. Do you have help for us? We have some financial issues. Can you help us? Everybody comes to the church as a consumer. Now, the biggest problem is that you and I are the worst consumers. Are you going to do the music I want? Is it going to be the kind of preaching I want? The kind of theology I want? Are you going to do this for our kids? Are you going to do this for our youth group? And if you don't do it, then we will go shop for another church because we're consumers. Okay. Now, I believe if we think like missionaries, that's what a missional church is, we always start where people are. Jesus always started where people are. He said to the woman at the well, give me a drink of water, and that started that whole conversation. With Nicodemus, they got right into theology. He started where people were to move them to where they needed to be. And so we have said to our churches, your strategy is to convert consumers to fully dedicated disciples of Jesus. Now, at this point, I want to talk to you about my description of some people who I think fit that description of a fully committed disciple of Jesus. As our churches in Northern California were turning around, we would take our pastors on field trips. And we would go to churches all over the country that were doing things so our pastors could learn from other pastors. And so we took about 20 pastors some years ago to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to Flamingo Road Baptist Church. A guy by the name of Dan Sutherland had come there. He's now pastoring in Kansas City, has written a book on transitions, which is a great book. When Dan went there, it was a church of 300 and all kinds of problems. The pastor had an affair and left. The treasurer had stolen money and left. The church was filled with issues. He said, we got to come in and work on these problems. He said, we're going to reach people for Jesus. And they began to basically implement a saddleback philosophy of ministry in that church. By the time they got to 10 years, he was there for about 20 years. 10 years into the ministry, the church was over 1,000. They'd built a new facility, and God was blessing. So we said, we're going down to Dan's conference to hear him. He was speaking one day, and in the conference, he mentioned the fact that in their church, they had a group of people called the Cotton Ball Club. So I went up to Dan during the break and I said, "Who's the Cotton Ball Club?" He said, "Well, we have some of them right here. They're sitting there at that table. Why don't you go ask them?" I said, "Okay." I went over, and it's a group of seniors. Now, it's Florida. It's God's waiting room. It's the land of blue hair and perpetual left turn signals, so that's Florida at this point. So I go up, and I say, some of you belong to the Cotton Ball Club? And they all said, "Oh, we're all." One lady says, "I'm chair of the Cotton Ball Club." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what's the Cotton Ball Club?" She said, "Well, as you know, we have now 3 services in this new facility. And as you also know, we do some pretty contemporary music. And our pastor, his avocation is he's a drummer. And even when he's not preaching, he's drumming. And of course, we go to the 11 o'clock service because that's what God ordained. It's the 11 o'clock service. And I said, "Let me ask you, where do you sit?" Now, they had theater seats. It was kind of in a big semicircle. They took the last seat all the way around the horseshoe. About 100 of them, or the Cotton Ball Club. And she said, "I sit in the middle seat every Sunday in the back. And as soon as the band walks out, I pull 2 bags of cotton balls out of my purse. And I open the bags, and I put 2 cotton balls in my ear, and I pass 1 bag this way and 1 bag this way, and we're the Cotton Ball Club." Okay. But then she said this. She said, "Now you need to understand, Paul. When it's time to sing, we stand. We sing. We clap. Now, if you ask our preference, we'd like an organ and a hymnal. But we look around and we see these young couples, we see these new people, we see those teenagers, we see these empty nests. If this brings them to Jesus, we'll sing it." That's a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ. When you're willing to give up your music to reach lost people, that's when a church's heart has changed. Okay? And so we say with people, you got to start with where they are. Now, consumerism is based on expectation. Okay? My wife and I have 3 restaurants in Sacramento we love. We go there, we really don't need a menu because we're going to order what we like, and we expect it to taste exactly the same as it did the last time. Worst thing a restaurant does is get a new chef who tinkers with the recipes. Okay. When my wife tricks me and I have to go to Kmart, I have expectations. It used to be greeters, they're all gone. Okay. But, people help me. That's why we didn't go to Kmart. When I go to Neiman Marcus, I see 3 people wait on me, but they see how I'm dressed, they don't talk to me because they know I don't have the right gold card. Okay? Expectations. When people walk into church, I don't care if you're in Delaware, I don't care if you're in St. Louis, I don't care if you're in Los Angeles, I don't care if you're in Seattle, people have the same 8 to 10 expectations. And if you don't do what they expect, they don't come back. Okay? Now, let me talk about some of these, and then I want to lift up a few because smaller churches can't do all of them. Worship and music. Now, let me talk to you briefly about the biggest problem we all have with music. All of us. I don't care whether you're a teenager, a 20-year-old, a 70-year-old, an 80-year-old. All of us like the music that was being played and sung when we had our most significant encounter with Jesus. And we want to impose that on everybody else. And so we don't do music for the mission. We do it for my preference. Now, the church that understood how you do it by mission, Lord of Life Lutheran Church in Ramsey, Minnesota. Ramsey, Minnesota is a northwest suburb of Minneapolis. It's up there with the Frozen Chosen. When they were 1,000, they had 5 services. The first service was liturgical. Second service was traditional. Third service was blended. Fourth service was contemporary. The fifth service was country western. And every Sunday the pastor went from robes to boots. Now, how you worship God with boots on, I have no idea. I know in that service they sang all the praise choruses backwards so they have a happy ending. Okay. But here's what they understood, that even in Minneapolis, there would be people who would cross the cultural barrier of a country western style to hear Jesus. Others would come with a liturgical style. Others would come with contemporary. So the question I ask is, what worship do? You do the worship that helps you achieve the mission in your context. It's not what I want, because it's not about me. And as Nate said this morning, I can have my music 24/7, okay? But people want worship in music. And by the way, quality outshines style, okay? But let me also say this. In most of our older churches, if you want to see the average age go down, and by the way, in churches there's only 2 ways to lower the average age, and one is unacceptable. And the older I get, the less acceptable it becomes. You don't lower it by getting rid of the older people. You lower it by bringing in a bunch of younger people. You need to begin to work on music. Not just music style. You need to begin to work on the way the service is done. I find most of our worship services just plain boring at this point. And we're living in a day and age where media saturates the culture at that point. Okay? So worship and music. Number 2, can I make friends? Will there be groups here? Can I get connected? Can I have what I call Christian social life, which God has made us to have? Number 3 is care. Now there's 2 kinds of care. There's newcomer care, which is assimilation, helping people make friends and get connected. And then there's congregational care. By the way, in our region, we outlawed the term pastoral care. In Ephesians chapter 4, there are 5 gifts: apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher. And the job of these 5 people is to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. And when churches ask pastors to be the one that does all the visitation, then they need to understand that they're asking them to do what go against the Bible. Okay. It got to we had so many people in our church that were serving people, and now you do it with deacons. We had deacons, but we had people who weren't even deacons. It got so that people didn't want to be that sick the pastor showed up, because he only did last rites. Okay. But people need to be cared for. 4th thing they're looking for is to work with infants, children, youth, adults. Americans go crazy when they have babies. Hang little yellow signs in the back that says baby on board. We're special. Hit the old people over there. Okay. I want to come back to children in a minute. Am I going to get developed? Are they going to be teaching? And can I learn? That's another thing people are looking for. Preaching, people expect. Now, the more unchurched they are, the more they look at preaching the way most Americans look at television commercials. I will put up with a commercial to get the program. Our neighbor, who we live now to 18 years, when we first moved in, this is Sacramento, California, he made sure I knew he was Buddhist. You know, he just put up the fence right away. So we've been working with him, we've been talking to him, and he's now become a believer. And but he said to me the other day, he said, you know, I've been going over to this big church on the freeway. It's a large Assembly of God church. They have about 1,000 people. He said, I love the music. But when that guy gets up to speak, he just goes on and on and on. He says, I just get up and leave. He said, you know, once you make the point, you don't have to keep saying it 18 times, you know. So he liked the music, but so I put him on to another church. I say, where I think you're going to like the preacher as well. But they look preaching. Well-kept facilities. So when I work with churches, I like to walk in the restroom and say, okay. In fact, I sometimes walk in the church and can smell the restroom. Okay. And financial stability. By the way, when you put in the bulletin, income last month, $5,000, expenses, $7,000, which the session wants you to put there to say, oh, you sluggards, it's time to give. People 45 and older feel guilty and never write a check. And people 45 and younger say they don't have their financial act together. I don't know if this is a church we want to come to. Now, you start with where people are to move them to where they should be. To say, I don't care about the worship. If I can quote Nate well, I don't care about the worship as long as we're going to reach people for Jesus. Okay? And that's where you want to go. Now, in this day and age, most churches that are small can't do all of those. So let me talk to you about the top three. I call these the growth engines of the church. Number one is Sunday morning worship. It is still the front door for most people into the church. And Sunday morning worship needs to be run, not to give the unbeliever what he or she expects, but to be run so that we honor them as a guest. I grew up near Fort Dix, New Jersey. In fact, my grandfather's farm is now part of Fort Dix, New Jersey. And every Sunday, we had military people over for dinner. I think my parents had the gift of hospitality. And when we'd sit down, it was the only good meal we had all week. It was the roast chicken and the mashed potatoes and peas and biscuits, you know. My father would say, I don't know what the custom is in your home, but in our home, we always give thanks for the food. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to bow your head and close your eyes. I will pray, and then we'll eat. So he'd say, bow your head, close your eyes. He would pray and say, all right, here's the potatoes, here's the chicken, and we would eat. Now, Tuesday night when we sit down for dinner, my father didn't say to the family, as you know the custom in our home, we always give thanks for the food. He'd just look at me and say, Paul, would you say grace? Because we knew what to do. But if you begin to reach unchurched people, they don't know what to do. And every Sunday you make sure that the guests are honored as guests. But Sunday morning worship is crucial. The next growth engine of the church is assimilation, connecting the guests who show up with friends, helping them become friends, helping them get connected. And here's the third one, children. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it used to be the youth group. That's no longer true. In this day and age, children rule. Children lead. If you don't believe it, wait till you ask your 10-year-old to help you with a computer and say, don't do it so fast, do it again slowly. Children lead. And if children want to get somewhere, the parents will get them there, and because they're helicopter parents, they will hover. 2 years ago, Forbes magazine had an article about how university graduates are going for their first corporate position with their parents. Time magazine in the last year had an article about how most colleges and universities across the country have to have some kind of a program for all the parents that keep hanging around. Okay. If you want to see your church grow, the children's ministry, two things need to happen. It needs to be so good that children go to school and talk about it. Because if they brag about it, the other kids are going to want to come, and their parents will get them there, and they'll hover. Number two, you got to have some major place in your building that just screams, we love children. If you use your fellowship hall for children, decorate it for children, not for adults. It says, we're about children. Now, I want to tell you one story, and then I'm going to see if there are any questions, and then I'll have a closing story. I was working with a Wesleyan congregation about up in the edge of the Adirondacks, about 25 miles south of Canada. The church was built in the 1840s because Wesleyans were abolitionists, and it was part of the Underground Railroad into Canada. There was a town there in the 1840s. When we did the consultation there about 5 years ago, there was no town. All that was left was the church buildings and two broken down barns that, nobody wouldn't protect anybody. That's all that was there. The buildings still are there from the 1800s. The congregation was 20 people, and the average age was 75. And we met to say, is this church going to live or is this church going to die? Halfway through the weekend, these older people said, we want to live. Because I told you, it's not easy to kill a church in the U.S. We want to live. We said, all right, we're going to give you one prescription with 3 implications. They said, what's that? The prescription is this, that whenever you have a choice between what is best for you and what is best for the community, you will choose on behalf of the community. These older people said, we'll do that. We said, let's see. We said, when younger people walk into church in this day and age, they want a cup in one hand and something to eat in the other. Now, this church had its theology all messed up. They thought the building was the church. They weren't sure they wanted to have communion in case somebody spilled something. We said, you've got to have some place where Sunday morning people can have something as they walk into the to the building. All they had was an extended foyer that was nothing much more than a cloakroom because it's so cold in the winter. The worship center only set 80. Now, these are buildings built in the 1800s. And these older people said, well, if this is going to help us reach people for Jesus, they literally, in the worship center, put a coffee bar. In fact, it's the only church I know now where you can sit in church and people smell the coffee. They get it. Okay, that was the first thing. Second thing, there was a little alley behind the church, and behind that was the fellowship hall. Now, this church's been there from 1840, so they had policies. One of the policies was you can't use the fellowship hall unless you're a member. Well, you had 12 members, and most of them were in their 80s. Sometimes a whole year would go by, and nobody would use the fellowship hall. So one Sunday, they voted, because that's the way Wesleyans do it, that any community group in the whole county that wanted to use the fellowship hall could use it for free. Now, those of you who live in small towns, you'll understand this. That afternoon, the head of the county government called the pastor. He said, I heard this morning your congregation voted to join the community. There was a McDonald's about 25 miles away. They went to this McDonald's. It was renovating. They said, you have something we want, and we don't have a lot of money. So now when you walk into the church, in this foyer, there's this little narrow desk with a great big sign that says, register your child. I go in small churches and say, why do we have to register our kids? Everybody knows our kids. Yeah, but if you have guests, you don't know them. Register a child, because people are concerned about child safety. So you register your child, and you say to the child, or say to the person, where's my child go? I said, you see that big round hole? That's the slide to the basement. That's what they bought from McDonald's, the slide. And the kids go down the slide to go to children's church, okay? In 1 year, in the middle of nowhere, this church was averaging 70 in worship. They had seen 12 people come to Jesus that year. Young families were coming because it was known in the county as the church with the slide. And because the kids wanted to get there, the parents got them there and hovered. Worship, assimilation, and children are the three primary ministries today to help a church turn around. Now, I have almost 5 minutes to 2. I want to take just about 10 to 12 minutes for questions. I've been talking now. This is the third session. People, what questions do you have at this point? Yes, sir.
Is one of the, like 9 or 10 on your list, relational stability? Because people pick up when there's conflict in churches.
Okay. Because I'm going to repeat for this. The question is relational stability there? No, it's not on the list, because that, again, it's almost like friendliness. People assume it's going to be good relationships. When it's not there, it's a surprise. And obviously, those relationships have to be dealt with, which is why, again, as I said last night, many churches have more disease than health, in part because they often won't deal with those relationships. And, the illustration I use is about every 3 months or 4 months, old Hank blows up at session meeting. Everybody says, oh, that's old Hank. Nobody ever confronts him. Says, no, that's inappropriate. You don't talk about that. Or somebody else says something about the pastor. Nobody goes to them and says, did you ask the pastor that? Have you talked about that? Do you realize talking about that to others is gossip? We don't do those things because, again, the relationships trump the mission. And you are right. The more toxicity there is in the church, it's amazing. The more people they just sense it, that somehow it's kind of intuitive. And at that point, they don't come back. No matter what you do, they don't come back unless those issues are addressed at that point. Which is why often when we do the Sunday of prayer, if that's been an issue in the church, if there's been a church where there's been a lot of gossip, or a church where people have done things, and we said, look, you got to before that day of prayer, you got to go get things right with people. But that needs sometimes to be said, God, forgive us for that. Forgive us for not doing that. Forgive us for not confronting, for not being, and rebuking in love. Not judgmental, but rebuking in love. That needs to be dealt with, because that will hurt a church to grow. Okay? All right? Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Back here.
There's
Let's get a mic to you.
A group of us in our church, closer. There's a group in our church who is working with the Fusion book.
Yeah.
And part of that says, as you've said, treat the guests with honor and,
Yes.
Gift cards and books and things like that. The one book that is recommended by CRC, whose name escapes me, the name of the book that he recommends giving away, deals with problems that draw people to the church. But that book is expensive. Mm-hmm. Do you know of another book that we can give out?
Do I know of another book? Well, right at this moment, nothing's coming to mind. I know there are other books out there, and that's where it's good sometimes to talk to some of the other churches and other pastors in the cohort to say, if you're going to give that book out, what would you give? And that's also where I would use ECO as a resource to say, what would you recommend? So that would be the thing to do, is really to talk to them. Because I have seen other churches where they do that. There's a whole number of different books. It seems to me there's one by, I think it's Mark Middleberg and some others that you can give to people, that kind of thing. Okay? Yes?
So we have an orange-sized congregation of, seems like a disproportionately large number of introverts. You mentioned the book Fusion. Do you have any other resources, specific resources related to the assimilation ministries?
Well, there are other resources we are using in terms of our training in the cohort. Where are you located? Where? Oh, okay, Bethlehem. But yeah, I am serious. Oh, let me say, the 20th of October, that weekend, I am organizing a field trip for 4 or 5 churches that are in the new cohort that are up in New York and Pennsylvania, Rome, Pennsylvania, Lycoming, Pennsylvania, Albany. They're going to go to the Cobleskill Church. I would, if you want to, I will. I give you my email or phone, I'll network you. I would highly encourage you to take as many people as you can there on a Saturday, and as many can stay for Sunday and watch them implement what they do. It will be the best way to help people see what's going on and see what materials they're using at that point. Okay? Yeah. In fact, I'll be glad to do that for anybody else if that's what you want to do. This church has done it we sent all the churches from Western Pennsylvania, and it just revolutionized because they actually got to see it work. In fact, if some people from Mount Holly want to go, I would be glad to network that. Yes?
Where on your slide there I rarely see in church happening, and I'd love to have an idea of how it might happen in a church, accountability.
Okay, yes. Let me, this is a structure piece, and I really didn't cover that, so that's a good question. Basically, we have set our churches up to be large churches. Here's what it means. The pastor, the staff work for the pastor. And when you take your mission statement, you break it down into 3 or 4 or 5 major, I call them big rocks. We want to see evangelism. We want to see discipleship that reproduces. We want to see leadership development. We want to see growth, etc. Every staff member has to write measurable goals for those areas, okay? In other words, if I'm in charge of children's ministry, what's our faith goal for a number of children that will come to Jesus this year? Our youth ministry, how many young people do we want to see come to Christ? Small groups, how many in our small groups have come to Christ? Congregational care, when you go visit a hospital, do you go see people who aren't getting visited and ask if you can pray and read scripture with them and reach out to them and see if so you set goals. Each staff member, as they set those goals, the pastor adds up all the goals. So say each area averages 3 new converts a year, and you've got 8 areas, 8 staff people. And by the way, the word staff, when I use it, has nothing to do with money. It's the marriage of authority, responsibility, and accountability. In our churches, when we started, they all became staff churches. The pastor was paid to be good, and all the rest of the staff were good for nothing. So they were all volunteers at that point. But they had the authority, the responsibility, and the accountability. Now, the pastor holds the staff accountable for their goals. But you add up all the evangelism goals, and suppose all the staff and the pastor say, this year we're going to see 20 people come to Jesus through the life of our congregation. That goal then is the pastor's goal that is given to the session. And the session's job is to hold the pastor accountable for that goal. The session is to hold the pastor accountable for what's the growth we want to see. If everybody says we're going to grow our ministry 5%, the church is going to grow by 5%. If we want to see 15 leaders developed in different ministry areas, that's the pastor's goal. Now, what that means is that the session, and by the way, we recommend that the session be no more than 3 to 4 people, because you no longer discuss ministry at session. The session's job is to hold the pastor accountable for goals. By the way, this ECO's teaching this, so this is not my heresy at this point, but just so you know that, okay? And what the session does, spend much of its time talking about the future. So like the church in Reading, you're in Reading, is to say, what are we going to be doing in 2 years? Well, let's talk about names, let's talk about locations. You're talking about those at session meetings, but the staff oversees the ministry. Now, when we did this with our churches, let me talk briefly about First Baptist Church of Napa. Now, you're Presbyterians, you all know where Napa is. Nazarenes don't. They don't admit to it anyway. Okay. On December 31st, all volunteers resigned. On January 1st, they had a new board. We use the word board because I didn't want to move them to elders yet, but board of 5 people. And by the way, to be on the board, you had to be committed to the mission and vision. You had to demonstrate you tithed, and you had to share what your ministry was besides just being a board member. The pastor, who was an interim, transitional pastor, had a staff of 12, all volunteers. And they took these 8 to 10 areas I've described, and each took their responsibilities. So at the first staff meeting, which was on a Tuesday night because these people, some of them had real jobs, he went around and said, here's your responsibility, here's your authority. So if you're in charge of children's ministry, you pick the curriculum, you can spend the money any way you want to, as long as there's money in the budget, etc. And then 2 weeks later, he said, you come back and bring measurable goals for the next 12 months. Now, when they came back, some of the goals could be accomplished in 3 months. So the pastor said we have to expand them. Some had goals that could choke a horse, so the pastor said we will condense them. But when they got all the goals settled, then the pastor took the goals to the session. I'll use it to the session. Said, do you like these goals? They said, yeah, we've never seen anything like this. Okay. Said, all right, sign your name. They literally signed their name. And then we said to the session, you now get dark glasses. Because here's your job. You're now Secret Service personnel for the pastor and the staff. Your job is to protect them while they achieve their mission and vision, because you've approved the goals. Okay. So 3 months from now, somebody comes up to you, you're a session member, and says, do you know what happened at the junior high youth retreat last week? Well, if you're a good session member, you don't know and you don't want to know. And somebody said, well, let me tell you what, no, wait a minute, I sense you're angry. Oh yeah, I'm angry. Have you talked to the youth staff person? No, I haven't. Well, then you can't talk to me, because if you tell me about it and you're angry at them, that's gossip. So you need to go talk to the staff person. Well, I'm not going to talk to them. All right, I'll go with you. I'll referee the conversation. And if they say, no, I'm not going to do that, then say, okay. But then if I hear about you talking to anybody else in the church about this, you'll come before the session for church discipline. You only have to do that once or twice. I'm serious. It's amazing how it gets rid of all the gossip in the church. I learned that my first pastor. One Sunday, a woman went out and said, Pastor, I can't tell you anything because you go tell that person I talked about him. I said, yeah, it's pretty biblical. I mean, Paul in 1 Corinthians, where he's going to dump on everybody, he says in chapter 1, by the way, I got all this stuff from Chloe. I've often wondered when that letter was read, and everybody turns around and looks at Chloe, and she's sitting there like this. But he didn't put an accusation without a name. Okay? So that's the job of the session. To do that is to make sure that the pastor's accountable. So, when you marry authority with responsibility, you create dictators. Mussolini did get the trains to run on time, but there were a few other problems. That's why you've got to have accountability. And so the pastor is held accountable. Our pastors literally would put their goals on their website, and they knew that if for 2 years they didn't reach goals, they would probably leave. Okay. I mean, that was just the understanding. But they also knew that the elders had their back. The elders were going to protect them. And there was no sense of taking a minority opinion out of session meeting. Because if you're not committed to the mission and vision, you shouldn't even be on session. So does that help in terms of the accountability? So that's a lot of stuff. The book, Winning on Purpose, is the key book to read in terms of that one. Okay? Thank you. All right? Yes, sir.
So you talked about the church that had 5 different styles of worship, from traditional to contemporary to cowboy.
Yeah.
What does that do to the makeup of the congregation? Don't you essentially have 5 separate congregations within one church body?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Unity is not related to geography. Unity is related to common commitment to the mission and vision. Spent 20 years in Denver, so I admit to being a Bronco fan. You put 75,000 people in the stands who don't know each other, and if you've met Bronco fans, that's a blessing. Okay. For 3.5 hours, you can get them to cheer together, be quiet together, stamp their feet together, used to be do the wave together, because they have a common mission to do all we can to help the team win, and a common vision. And that is to see the Broncos walk off the field victorious while the godless Oakland Raiders are carried off in stretchers. Okay, that's the vision. Okay. Now, our church in Denver, we had 11 services on Saturday and Sunday, 4 locations. But the thing that tied us together is all of us were always talking about the same mission and the vision. And it was interesting. Our people integrated as they joined in ministry together. It doesn't come from sitting in the same room together. Okay? So, yeah, I mean, if you don't have mission and vision, then you get 5 clicks. But when the whole thing is for mission and vision, it's another whole matter. Okay? Okay, I'll take one more question. Right here. Yes, ma'am.
This is an easier question, fundamental. Will you explain what a cohort is and how it works?
Okay, sure. A cohort is, let's say, having 8 pastors from a presbytery. If you like, it would be this one because you're all close enough where you could do a geographical cohort. It would be having 8 pastors meet together for 18 times in 2 years. We meet for 9 months each year. And in that time, we do training in leadership, congregational health, and all the things pastors never got at seminary or from denominations. Okay, and this is the way ECO is delivering it, but we talk about it. Okay, now every church that's in a cohort also has to have a church consultation, which I've been talking about. So a consultation is a weekend where at the end of the weekend I say to a congregation, here's your top 5 strengths, here's your top 5 concerns, and we write a prescription with deadlines for each of the 5 concerns, most of the deadlines occurring in the next 12 months. The congregation has a month to think about it, pray about it, interact with it, etc., but then they vote. The congregation votes as an opinion poll, the session votes whether to do it or not. If they vote to do it, ECO then gives that congregation a coach who walks alongside them for the minimum of 1 year. So the consultation technically is a year long. So as you're wrestling with some of these questions about assimilation, or you're wrestling with this idea about structure, the coach is there helping you at that point. That's the second piece. So the first piece is pastors getting training. But if pastors go get training, I mean, that's been happening for years and nothing's happened. They need the training, but then there needs to be coming in and actually getting your hands dirty, working with the congregation. The third piece is 4 times during those 10 years, we do lay training for the congregations of the cohort. So tomorrow, I am in Western Pennsylvania, and from 2:30 to 5:30, I am training representatives from all these, as many as they can bring, from all these congregations on the governance issue and on funding, how to look at funding from a 2018 perspective. Okay, so we're training the pastors, we're doing the consultation, and then there is the training of the laity. And we find that when that happens, right now, our batting average, we're in 1.5 cohorts. In that first cohort, we're batting about 700 to 800 of congregations turning around. I've done 4 consultations in the second cohort. I'm pretty sure 3 of them are going to take off already. We're doing 4 or 5, I got 4 or 5 more to do this fall. But that's what a cohort is. Does that answer the question? I think it's the best thing you can do as a presbytery, because I do this all. I do this. I've done it with Anglicans. I've done it with Mennonites. I've done it with Pentecostalists. And every time the churches grow, because it's not just helping individual churches, but there's a sense of camaraderie and mission that the churches begin to create among themselves. Okay? All right, I want to close with one story. I mentioned last night First Baptist Church of San Francisco. I told you when I did the consultation there in 1998, there was 170 old white people. In 5 years, they had a new pastor who came to the church. His name was Phil Busby. And Phil Busby said two things. He said, number one, I have not come to be the pastor of First Baptist Church of San Francisco. He said, I've come to be the pastor to San Francisco. I want to see this city changed. Number two, he said, I'm sick and tired of hearing that God can't grow a church in San Francisco. No more than 2% of the population go to a church, mosque, or synagogue in the city of San Francisco. In 5 years, his church is 500. Every third person's Asian. The average age is 32. 60% of the church is single, representing the people who live in San Francisco. For 5 years, he had been networking with other congregations, and on one Saturday, 140 congregations in San Francisco and in the suburbs immediately around San Francisco hung door hangers on 2/3 of all the residences in the city of San Francisco. And the door hanger said, today the Christians of San Francisco have prayed for you. Because when they would hang the door hanger, they would pray for that household. That night they were having a big rally, and they had invited the mayor of San Francisco to come. The mayor at the time was Willie Brown, very famous West Coast politician. Mayor Brown's advance people said, Mayor Brown will come. I mean, there are going to be too many votes. He wasn't going to miss this. He will come. But whatever you do that's religious, when he's walking in, if you're singing, if you're praying, if you're preaching, stop it. He'll come in, march up to the platform, make your presentation, and then he'll turn around and leave, and whatever you do, don't you dare pray for him. That night they were singing where Mayor Brown's came in with his team. They stopped the singing. He walked up to the platform. And Phil Busby, the pastor of First Baptist with 140 pastors behind him, said, Mayor Brown, over the years, many pastors, many churches have said very horrible things about our city. Some of the things weren't even true, but many of them were very, very nasty. And they've called our city all kinds of names. And so I've been asked by all the pastors here, since you're the mayor, to apologize to you and ask you to forgive us for what the Christians have said. Because you see, Mayor Brown, you need to know we love our city. And the reason we love our city is because God loves our city. And we want to see His righteousness, His rule, His love reign in our city. And to prove it, we want to give you this, and they handed him an envelope. When Mayor Brown opened the envelope, there was a check in there for $50,000 for women and children with AIDS. First words out of his mouth were, praise the Lord. And then he said, this month, as I've driven into the city, come across the bridge, he said, it's been like a curtain across the skies. No hope, no light, darkness. And for the first time, I sensed light. Then he looked at Phil, said, do you think you and the pastors could gather around me and pray for me? Now, only God does that. But God does that through churches who are growing because they're committed to a mission. They're committed to Jesus. And there's no reason why that can't happen and begin in a presbytery. I drove out yesterday with Scott and saw where George Whitefield preached. You know, you have a great heritage here, folks. I mean, I'm from the East Coast. I know what was going on and what happened, you know, in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And God wants to see people come to Jesus. And it's no reason why a revival can't start with the eco churches in this part of the country. So I want to pray God's blessing on you, your presbytery. And Barry, thank you for the invitation. Let me pray. Our gracious God, I want to thank you today for all that you do for us. I want to thank you for these 2 days. I want to thank you for the women and men who are here. I've sensed, as many of them have talked and asked questions and interacted, that they want to see you and your Spirit blow through their churches in a mighty way. And you know, and I've been able to get to see it, that when the heart changes, you show up in places where for years there has been little hope. And I pray that with the congregations of this presbytery, you will give them great hope, great excitement, because of what you want to do through the people in this room and their willingness to say, we will put the mission of Jesus Christ first. May you do that for the sake of people who are missing from the church. And may you do that for your honor and your glory and your reputation. Bless these churches and this presbytery, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Paul, before you go, we want to pray for you.
Okay.
Father God, thank you for Paul, for his message of hope to us this weekend. We ask, Lord, that you would cause that message to go forth in power in each one of our hearts and minds, Lord, that you would change us from the inside out to be able to apprehend that which we've heard and put it into practice in our churches. We pray for Paul, Lord, that you would bless him, that you would encourage his heart, that you would give him the energy and stamina that he needs to continue to teach us how to do these things that you have laid on his heart and are laying on our hearts. Bless him, keep him safe in his travels. Bless his family, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, sir.
God bless you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.